You know, I'm think of myself more as a technology writer than a science writer, and what I've reported on over the years have been engineering sciences as much as covering Silicon Valley, which is a business, and which is why I brought Christoph along, because I think of him as a real science writer. But I thought I wanted to start with a quote, which you're never supposed to do in an article, but I just love this quote, so I thought I'd begin here, which is, "Science values detail, precision, the impersonal, the technical, the lasting, facts, numbers, and being right. Journalism values brevity, approximation, the personal, the colloquial, the immediate, stories, words, and being right now." There are going to be tensions, which is really true, and it's even more true. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to sort of frame where we are by talking more initially about sort of where reporting and the media is now. And Christoph is going to talk more specifically about where science journalism is now and where it's going. But I think that the context is the world in which science journalism is living, and it's a time to really think about the context. So this is what's going on for print journalism in America right now. This is obviously an extraordinary period. By any stretch of the imagination. We're in unknown territory. We've gone in a half a decade from this period where the internet was clearly undermining the business model of mainstream journalism publishing to this period last year where there was a concerted political attack on the traditional watchdog role of the press last year. To this year, where there is a new administration in Washington that has launched a concerted attack both on the independent press in America, but it also, for related reasons, an attack on the credibility and the financing of the science community as a whole, too. And so, for the first time, we have the possibility, as extraordinary as it might have sounded a year ago, that actually doing science writing might soon be seen as a political act, which is extraordinary. So how did we get here? So my view on what's going on in this transition from print to online journalism has really changed in the last 6 months. The blue line, of course, is the number of people working for newspapers. The green line is internet publishing and online writ large. And so it looks like it's kind of promising. It looks like there's this chasm, you cross the chasm. And for a long time, I would tell people, well, look we're going through this transition. Old media is dying, but there's all this wonderful experimentation. It's really this great time in a lot of ways. There are these new publications popping up. And I would tell this to young journalists, technology writers, that even though it's chaotic, give it some time. It's going to sort out. Things will be okay. And sadly, I think, I've really changed my mind in the last 6 months, and largely because of the article I recently read in Columbia Journalism Review that shows that it's not true. This is what happened to the hiring of online journalists in America. There was robust growth until 2013, and then it leveled off. And it leveled off at about 10,000 jobs, which is just a fraction of what's gone away. And so the reality is, although there is a thriving blogosphere, which we can I'm sure we'll talk about, that professional journalism, the number of people, just absolute people, is declining, and it's a big deal. It fits right into this issue that we're all dealing with. I'm not going to talk so much about fake news, although we could talk for days about it, I'm sure. Google and Facebook are struggling to create both human and algorithmic systems to control the content on their sites with debatable luck so far. But I wanted to actually point out another part of the equation, which I think has gotten a less attention, but is equally intriguing, and it's perhaps more difficult to fix, because the model, of course, is advertising. It's eyeballs. That's what you're monetizing. And I bring it up here because I'm virtually certain that machine learning techniques are now being used for fraudulent generation of revenue on the internet. It's not so much fake news, it's fake traffic, which, of course, if you've looked at it all, is very much wound into the fake news problem. And the numbers are maddeningly hard to understand, but what you have to understand is there are no good audits. There is no ABC of circulation the way there is in the print world. And so the consensus seems to be, and these are Google Analytics showing how much of this traffic to this particular site is coming from bots. But the consensus is that something like half of all traffic is now not human. And so we have fake stories being read by fake humans, which is just this remarkable turn of events in so many ways. And one great measure of the emergence of this phenomenon is there's now this lively industry of people basically selling Turing test systems to publishers so that they can try to tell whether humans are reading their articles or not. This is going to be a losing war, I can tell you. If it's an arms race, the bad guys are going to win, and they may be winning already. I really can't. This is a sort of breakdown. I've seen all kinds of numbers. The bad guys are the 20% numbers. I mean, there's a lot of stuff like search engines that are bots that are not bad, but I've seen many estimates that the actual bad number traffic is much higher than that, perhaps as much as half of all traffic, which of course leads to this sort of richly ironic point. This is John Wanamaker, who was invented the last generation of advertising, display advertising, and he said, a century ago, half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. And if you think about what this internet revolution was supposed to do, it was supposed to give us this precise ability to target individuals, but the reality is we basically don't know which half is. We're right back where we were a century ago, which I think is just absolutely ironic. So I just wanted to frame the situation facing science journalism today with that kind of discussion of the environment. Christoph and I both picked up the same slide. There was this halcyon time, which I guess he's going to point to too, but I wanted to just sort of note that for some reason between 1984 and 1986, 45 science sections were created in the United States. And I'd love to go back to understand why that is the case. It's not immediately clear what was so interesting. I mean, Reagan was in office. Why then? If you go back to that revenue slide, it was probably because there was a real bump in newspaper revenue. And a lot of the feature articles, some of them science articles, in the newspaper trade are called furniture. And the furniture is sort of what surrounds the ads. And of course, when you get more advertising, you need more furniture. And that, I think, was one of the things that led to the creation. And I just sort of wanted to say where we are now. So there are these, I mean, STAT and Mosaic are two examples I just wanted to point out of new experiments that are interesting. But if you'll note, they're both life sciences oriented or health oriented. In a cynical way, I'd say it's sort of an example of following the money. The readership is aging. They have more health problems. You present them with articles about health. You can also see down in the corner, one of the reasons, I was in the Times Science section for a half a decade. It was an experiment from 2010 to 2015, reporting on the engineering sciences within the science section, and as they moved more and more in sort of a health direction, you can see the tabs. The tabs are environment, space, and health. And as they moved in that direction, there was less and less space. And so in 2016, I came back to the technology section just because it was too hard to get my stuff into the paper. That's sort of the high-level sort of framing that I wanted to set. And maybe now I can turn the podium over to Christoph, and then I have some questions for him, and we'll go from there.
Just a few words about Christoph. Christoph Drösser is a freelance journalist who writes regularly for Die Zeit and for other print, broadcast, online, and book publishing media in Germany. He's written a book on how algorithms are shaping our daily lives, a book on research about music and the brain and why everybody is musical, and a book on fuzzy logic, among other works. He has held the Knight Journalism Fellowship at MIT, and he has been journalist in residence at the Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics in Santa Barbara. Christoph.
Thank you. Yes, I want to talk a little bit more about the science part in the science journalism. And maybe I have some more positive things to talk about. But I mean, I share the big picture that John outlined here. And I want to go back, and because science journalism is journalism, but it's always been a bit different from what the other guys in journalism are doing. And if we go back to the beginnings, I call the first era the cheerleader era, when it was the situation was there was science, they were finding out great things about nature and the world and the cosmos. Then there was the public who didn't have a clue about what these people were doing, so they needed an interpreter, and that was the job for science journalists. They had to translate that complicated language of science into words that everybody could understand, and then the public would understand what everyone was talking about. So that was the job of the science journalists. And many scientists today still have the idea that science journalism's job is to, take that complicated stuff, make it understandable for the general public, and translate it to them. That was maybe in the 1960s. People like Carl Sagan, or you still have some of these figures today. I mean, if you take a magazine like Scientific American, the point of it is let scientists write about their stuff, and you mix it with articles written by journalists, but basically they're doing the same thing. They're publicizing science. If you would say that to a political writer, political journalist, your job is to take what Washington is doing, put it in plain words, and put it out to the public, they would probably disagree. Then came an era where, especially when people cared about the environment, and there were problems with science. So the relationship between the science and the public was kind of not as harmonious anymore, and there were conflicts of interest and scary things that scientists did. The products of science polluted the air and everything, and journalists started to be watchdogs and look at what was happening, be very critical. There was, if you take the first generation of writers that were environmental writers, they were very skeptical of everything that the biochemical sciences put out in the environment. And so there weren't advocates or cheerleaders of science anymore. There were critics of science, and were very skeptical about it. And it was often a biased kind of journalism, and that's why I would say the third era was the one where science writers really became journalists in the sense that in other beats, in politics or in the business sections, they have been all along, namely people that take what comes from these fields but have a critical view on it, be competent enough to judge it, and then are only responsible to their readers, to the public, take influences from science, but also from industry, from politics, from the PR people that are around everywhere now, even in the sciences, filter that stuff and come to a conclusion and tell that to their readers. I found there's an actual diagram of the health communication network, it was called, in some publication. So it's not only 2 or 3 players, it's tens of players, from companies to scientists to shareholders and whatever, and journalists are just one little cog in this system, and they play their role there. And the traditional situation was that we had this wall that we had between all these people and the public, and we used to be the doorkeepers. We decided what gets through to the public after our deliberations and research, and in the best of all worlds, it was good research, and it was thorough, and it was actually something that was good for people. And then came the internet, right? And this is John's slide about it was actually in science, this thing about the increasing number of science sections, and between 84 and 86, 47 daily newspapers began weekly science sections. And then they had ones that had only one page that was counted. So it was a ton of stuff. That was the time when I started becoming a science journalist. There were programs trying to bring scientists into journalism because they didn't have enough people to fill all these new pages, not only in the US, also in other countries. Like the fellowships were founded, like Knight Fellowship at MIT. So big time. And then came the internet. And at first it was great. It was, well, it burned down that wall. But first we had that wall still. So I remember when I had internet access as a journalist and the public didn't have internet yet. That was a minority. It was so great that we could find stuff now online, which we had to make tons of phone calls or send faxes out to institutions. I remember when I was doing an article on NASA in the early 90s. I was sitting in Germany as a freelance writer just with my phone and fax machine, and I had to get this, it was the report on the Challenger disaster. It was a printed brochure it wasn't like secret material that I had to find out. But just to get this mailed from NASA to Germany, I was one of the few people who had this in my hand, and I could base a story on it with additional interviews, but it was just the access to information was so hard for ordinary people that we had this privilege of getting this. And then when we had internet access and the others didn't, it was even better for us. It got a lot more easier to find, especially in the sciences, because the science people were the first ones on the net, right? So it was very easy for us to get information and then give it to the public. But then this wall burned down, because everybody was on the internet now. And so suddenly these people could talk directly to the public. So we were somewhere in the middle there, but these arrows went past us suddenly. Everybody could go on the internet and find information. And when we published online our articles, they started commenting. And if we had an error or a mistake, they were pointing it out immediately. Before you could get away with little stuff, right? Now you can't. If a number is wrong or a fact is wrong, they come at you immediately, and the public can talk back with comments and whatever. So we're suddenly in the middle of this network of people who talk to each other, and the question is, and that's maybe something we can get into in the discussion, is what's our job there? What's special? I mean, we can write nicely. Is that necessary? Do you need that if you want information? Or what do we bring into that mixture that makes it worth paying us money for it, right? When you can get everything for free. And so we have a new continuum of publication. On the one hand is the pure scientific publications in the lingo from scientists for scientists. Then you have classical journalism on the other side. But there's a lot in between. There is scientists that write blogs. There are professional bloggers. And so you can have all kinds of levels of specificity, or be more closer or further away from the actual science in science writing. And for the reader, if I see myself as a reader, it's a great thing if I can read like something like Quanta magazine that is financed by the Simons Foundation. It's a great publication because I, as someone who is I'm a mathematician myself, so I can read a little bit of the lingo, but not the original publication. I find a new level of writing, of good creative writing, that I wouldn't get in a general interest newspaper, because they would say that's too complicated. We can have that here. So we have this new spectrum, which is great. Of course, the open question is who of these people can make money on what they're doing, and what is a sustainable business model for these publications. In some cases, like Quanta, it's a foundation that says, okay, yep, take the money and do something good with it. I don't know if that's if you can generalize that model, or if you still have to have publications based on advertising, or even readers paying for it. And I think no one has the solution at the moment, and that's what we're all looking for. And John gave you the numbers. It's a big problem, and with that problem, we start the discussion here. Maybe we could do the.
So why don't we start with the question? I mean, this is I'm thinking about this. This is wonderful in one sense, that the scientists can directly reach the reader. There's, they cut us out. They cut out the middlemen. But is it all positive? I mean, what happens? So I began to think about conflict of interest. If the scientist has unfettered access to the readership, to the audience, yeah, does that completely serve the reader?
Well, the first question I would reply with, or the first answer I would give you is, has science journalism ever been really critical journalism in the way that, you have to be, in order to criticize something, you have to be competent. And if you're a science, even at big institutions like the New York Times or our paper, we had like 5 or 6 science writers for all of science, and you can't be an expert in everything. So it's always a question of whether you can report critically on what science is doing if you don't understand the basics of it, or you always need someone in that country, in this foreign country, called science as your guard that you can rely on, that gives you stories and information.
And I would argue that's where traditional journalistic methods come into play. I mean, the stories that I've written that have sort of looked at bad acting in science have all come from sources within the scientific community itself, people who see things and sort of bring you into that community. And that seems to be something, I mean, to the extent the blogosphere could do that, the blogosphere is doing that. I don't know if they're doing any better of a job than we did over time. And please, let's open this up to whatever degree we'd like to, if there are questions. Yeah.
I'm curious what role you think journalists and scientists have in the deteriorating public opinion of science.
I mean, what kind of responsibility we had for the fact that you want to take that first? So that's a very difficult question I mean, just personally as someone who sort of worked inside the cathedral, if you will, for a long time. I mean, I'm a little bit different than most traditional journalists, because I actually began my career, if you will, as an activist, and was politically active for many years. And then at a certain point, I decided that there was a value in journalism as separate from activism, that there was a role in society for this party that I thought of as a fair witness. And that, I mean, it was almost like a religious thing on my part. I changed what I did, and I thought, okay, this is part of democracy. This is this role that the Constitution has provided, and I tried to take that position. And now, when you sort of see us, there's not a day that goes by where my social media stream is not full of people who believe that the Washington Post and the New York Times lie. That's a belief. And there's absolutely nothing I can do. I just sort of feel hopeless. To engage them, why do you believe this? Well, I don't know that I can dissuade them from their belief. It's this new era that we're in, which may be very much like, so maybe the anomaly is actually to have this kind of press that tried to be a fair witness. I mean, in Europe, at least my perception of Europe is that traditionally political parties have had allied papers and press has been adversarial. Am I right?
Not every paper is aligned with the party, right?
Yeah,
it's not
true.
It's not that way. But they all have. But like here, right? True. I mean, the New York Times is not objective somewhere in the political spectrum.
Well, it's sort of funny. It sort of depends on where you stand, because I was funny. I see all these people, attacking the New York Times for being such a liberal publication. I go, it's funny, it's funny. From being inside, it's funny. I say to myself, it's funny. It seems so right wing to me. So it really does depend on where you stand. So that's a sort of.
Well, and I think you have to answer the question differently for different branches of science. If you're reporting on stem cell research or something that has a lot of implications for the public and for the lives of people, you have to follow it. You have to be very skeptical. You have to really bring in people's interest into the game. If you report on mathematics, which I do from time to time, it's really you don't follow the science closely and report on everything that's happening. You pick stuff out of it. Maybe Erica can tell us about it. You try to pick stories that you can relate to a general audience, and it's not the most important research that's happening, but it's stories that are that you can explain the question. So in math, it's often hard to explain even the question, not let alone the answer to a certain problem, right? So that's certainly not critical reporting in the sense of different interests that conflict with each other.
So one of the things I have trouble understanding as someone who tries to follow, the field of computing, for example, as a journalist and as a reader, the decline of, if there are fewer journalists, to what extent has that slack been picked up by the blogosphere, if you will? And it's hard. It's just hard for me to tell. I mean, in some sense, it seems like a really rich and lively time. There's something on everything, and yet it's not systematic. And so I wonder.
Was it ever?
Well, there were points at which you had a large number of professional journalists who had beats, and there was a structure. For example, in 30 years ago in Silicon Valley, there were weekly publications, there were daily publications, and there were trade publications that were weekly. And there was a very clear structure, and you knew that there was someone who was an expert at a certain level who was following every detail in that field. I saw a research paper that looked at the field of nanotechnology and found that there were, in 2011 in the US, 429 journalists who had written stories about nanotechnological subjects. But then when you actually sort of looked at how many of them had written, they set the bar at 25, which seemed to be a little bit high to us. But that number, 25 stories by a single byline in a single year, that number fell to 7 reporters. So it just seemed like that the kind of beat reporting, and maybe you're right. But if you're not doing it as a beat, where you're in touch with the people who are the practitioners in the field, then something's lost. It seems to me, and I don't know to which. I know there's some bloggers who take this on as professionals, and maybe in a sense the independent journalist is the model going forward. Maybe you're actually the future. You're sort of. You have both of us actually now have sort of an independent journalist stature. Maybe the future is the journalist is a brand and you follow the individual as opposed to following the institution.
Yeah, I don't see the revenue stream yet.
This is a problem.
I'm just curious, maybe you know the answer. So for the science, who is your readership? Who is consuming what you're writing or what the science writing? And I don't mean the hot topics that are already politicized, but the other topics that are not politicized, which actually are building are really consumption and not just who are the people and why are they reading science journals?
Well, so I had a mental model in my mind when I was a science journal at the New York Times that I was sort of writing for the person who also read Scientific American. So it was a college-educated, informed, and interested person who was not an expert in the field but wanted to know what was going on. But that was, that was before this. That was when the wall was there, and it was a model in my head. I didn't really know.
We always had the wife of a dentist in a small town in Germany. So.
Yeah. So.
No, there always was a spectrum, right, of more or less general audience publication. But if you take a general audience publication, like Die Zeit is I don't know, most of you won't know it. It's a weekly paper in Germany, and on the contrary to what John showed, I always say we because I left 2 years ago. They have a circulation that's actually rising. It's 500,000 a week in print.
That's it.
Or it's stabilizing. They're scared, completely scared about the future because the ads are going down. But that's a different story. The circulation basically is kept at a level, and for that publication, it was always the great advantage of a newspaper is that it's a limited space. So you give your reader a package every week, what you think is important or interesting or funny or entertaining this week, and you offer that package to them, and they're happy with it, and then they stay your customers. Most of them complain it's too much already, But of course, in this internet world, it's bottomless, and every online publication is bottomless. The New York Times online, you know, they're scared, you know, that of people who scroll and ever reach the bottom, but you won't reach the bottom. Yeah. And yeah, that's a difference. And if you are bottomless, you can, of course, go into arbitrary detail and be very specific. Whereas if you have this weekly package that's limited in space, then you have to make editorial decisions and have to decide what you think is important for people. And the other thing was we didn't have click rates for single articles in the past, and still don't have it in print journalism. So no one, if I would write a little math piece, people would think, okay, no one's reading that anyway. But we're putting it in there. We can't control for it. We can only have the success of the whole package in the end. Now they've found techniques to do that in print every couple of months, and online every story is rated immediately by the people who read it, and then you see how their priorities change, and suddenly the science might go to the bottom of the page.
The other thing that's going on is there's this tremendous convergence of media that's really shaken things up in really interesting ways. You know, I lived and died as a print reporter. I couldn't figure out how to create a graph or actually take a video. Actually, I once got a ride on a submarine in Monterey Bay, which was great. It was really fun, but I had a camera, and there was an algae bloom, and so you couldn't see out the window of the submarine. And I filed this video, and somebody posted it was the worst video they'd ever seen online. I knew that I wasn't going to be more than a print reporter. But the Times has done two experiments that I think are really illustrative. About 5 years ago, we did something called Snowfall, which was about an avalanche in Washington, in which we tried to sort of converge the three, print, animated graphics, and video and sound, and sort of create this new media in a less than artificial way. And it was beautiful. It took the Times probably 20 or 30 people in 6 months to produce one story. So it was very difficult, and I haven't seen progress in tools come very quickly. More recently, and a more interesting experiment, which I just looked at and it was just amazing to me. A young social media editor at the New York Times was walking down the street in New York, and she looked down on the street and she saw a slide, a photographic slide, and she picked it up, and it was kind of interesting. It looked interesting. And then she saw there was a trail of them. And the Times at this point had this experiment going. We still have this experiment going with Facebook Live. And so she turned on her camera, and she began sort of telling the story, exploring this, what she was finding on Facebook Live. And she took these slides, and they led to a garbage can where there was a bag of slides, and she began to look through them and saw that they were really well done slides, and she sort of became a detective and discovered that they were the slide collection of a now dead science writer for Newsweek, who had been dead for 4 years. And it turned out that her former boyfriend had kept the slides in his apartment for 4 years, and then sort of had some sort of emotional crisis and threw them out. And I mean, if you go to the Times and look at it, it was an example to me of a really good job at what looks like a new media. In a sense, it's an old media, because if any of you remember Max Headroom, which was this British science fiction film in the 1980s, where the investigative reporter carried a camera, Sony Betacam, around on his shoulder and talked to an AI at the same time. It was a wonderful show. But this was sort of a step in that direction. And so I got a glimpse of this new media, of this sort of seamless and sort of wonderful blurring of the lines of these separate technologies. But it's really hard, and you also have to have a good story. She had a really nice story.
So this is, well, maybe I'll ask, I have a question about ads, but maybe I'll delay that until later and ask a question about like new mediums. I feel like there's been, the Times, I think, is an instance of a publication that has a lot of really cool kind of interactive things that actually do take advantage of the web's unique attributes over print or TV or whatever. But I feel like, at least from my point of view, like the kind of we've barely brushed the surface of like what is conceivable, and like a lot of stories are told as this kind of like the way traditional stories told, like a linear, like narrative kind of article thing. In a lot of cases, to me, where it doesn't really make sense to do that at all. For example, like if you're covering like a political speech or something, there will be a sort of a linear sort of summary or something of it. Have you seen I guess what I'm asking is why do you think there hasn't been?
So what I've seen, and I wish I could, this is like a couple of years ago, I was spending a lot of time on this, there are experiments with new tools for storytelling that have all been, and there's some, and I'm blanking on names, there are some really beautiful ones out there that are, it's just this, all of a sudden there are a million vectors, you can go in any direction, and so there's, the tools are beginning to be played with. I don't think they've emerged yet in any useful way for people like me. And also, there's different kinds of activities. There's this notion of storytelling where you don't have a deadline. You just sort of work on the story until you get it. I, for most of my career, lived in a world where you work to a deadline. And it's amazing how little the tools have changed for people who are in a competitive situation and have to do it as quickly as possible. There are not, since the invention of the word processor, we haven't come very far, it seems to me. Have you seen good stories?
What I think is new is data journalism, data-driven stories that can combine with infographics, and you can do amazing stuff with that. I edited a whole page in Die Zeit for the last 5 years that was just a graphic page. It was static, of course, it was on paper, but just telling stories in graphics, not just have some simple like Excel diagrams, but having illustration and data together. And of course, online you can do a lot more with this because it can move, it can be interactive, and but it's a lot of work, for example, and it's expensive. It's still not so automated, these tools that you can just throw a bunch of data in and then a great story comes out. So all these new forms, John talked about this long form online stuff. It's all labor intensive still, and only big companies can do that. And you have to invest in people and doing that. And if you look at the figures that you showed, most online publications, and I'm not doing something now with Spiegel Online, some interactive stuff. And if I tell you what they pay me for that, you'll be laughing at me. So it's still a lot of work that you put into that, and to pay people to work on one story for several weeks, multiply a weekly salary by the time, and that's not everybody can pay that.
So I had a question. There were lots of circles around in one slide: politics, government, PR, and all, and there was another separate slide, public. So the question was that, does that separate wall of public need to be there, or is it more like internet has brought a common platform between politics and...
Well, that was like the old world, that from the view of a journalist, there was a public on one side, that was the people you are facing and that whose advocate you are, and then there's the big nasty dirty world behind you that you try to sort the information from, and I think that's over. That was the idea of my slides, that this time is past, that you're just sitting there as the doorkeeper of information to the public. It's all rushing past you, and you have to find your special role in that. And one of the roles is, well, first of all, you can invest, if you're a paid professional journalist, you can invest more time into getting to the bottom of things. And if you're a good writer, you can tell stories in a way that the pure facts that might come from science or from somewhere else, don't do. So good storytelling is more than ever a good quality that a journalist must have.
I just wanted to continue the media conversation a little longer, and I'm all for the really great data graphics that New York Times and Bloomberg and so on have been innovating on. In fact, I teach that. But my question is more the other direction, not the New York Times, but the other journalists seem to be moving a lot more towards just straight shot video, and just generally communication seems to be video and not writing. And so I'm wondering what you think the future of the written word is in journalism, be it science journalism or general journalism, and does it have a very limited future even for those who prefer to read?
I've watched the move to video. I mean, I'm still not sure. as all of this comes slamming together, this is where I get really frustrated. I thought it would sort itself out over a decade. Now I think that maybe it's just going to be chaotic for the foreseeable future. The Times has experimented, for example, with video over and over and again, and I've watched us hire entire teams of videographers and then fire them all, and we've done that 2 or 3 times as we've tried to find our way. And then there are these startups like Vice and others that are doing video-oriented journalism, and some of it's just great, but I'm not sure if it's being funded by venture capital investment or whether there's actually a real business there. I sort of want to wait and see that we're seeing the rise of a new media here, or whether it's an artifact of Silicon Valley venture capital and will be washed away. I don't think it's clear yet.
If you go to USA Today or CNN, all these other sites and the print versions, they seem to have very little written text. So New York Times is a holdout, I would say. It's like, so that's my question.
That's interesting.
I can tell you from Die Zeit online, people love to read long stories. They get more clicks than the short stories. But for example, we haven't talked about Facebook at all. Less and less people go to the homepage of a newspaper and look what's on the menu, but they get their feeds from Facebook and from stories that are linked there. And of course, on Facebook, video works better than just text, and they don't have audio really. But so you have these 1 minute in a 1 minute video. That's the most clicked items on Facebook. So this Facebook algorithm decides more and more about what people get offered at all, and then also what they click and what they read. So and I don't know if all I think no publisher really has an answer to how to deal with that, right? The New York Times just stopped collaborating with Facebook on these direct stories that you publish on Facebook, and so we're all victims or subjects of these algorithms that they put in place.
Yeah.
So, just as far as this continuum goes, I guess so. Like from my point of view, pure math and like theoretical computer science do a much poorer job than, say, theoretical physics at popularizing themselves. And I guess I've thought a bit about it being a good thing to popularize these areas, but I've also played devil's advocate for myself, and I want to just ask you about this then. Are there downsides to popularizing your field? As in, can it cheapen it, or even, especially if it's, I guess there's 2 things. One could be the population sees it in kind of an oversimplified way, like with quantum mechanics this happens, where you have all this quantum mysticism of a sort. But on the second side, the scientists themselves, could it kind of, has it in other fields driven some kind of inflation to be like impressive to the population, or if some scientists move over on this spectrum, does this drive some sort of inflation where you kind of drive the field towards just being the hot topic or something?
Well, it's an old story that scientists who go out into the public are snubbed on by their peers. I don't think there's some of these superstars here, I won't name names, but where you think, do they do science anymore, or are they only on TV? And they might get some, bad raps. But as opposed, now to your question, physics has the advantage that it's still talking about the real world. So even if it's quantum mechanics, that you can put it in, and then there was this soup of particles and the Big Bang and whatever. It's still related to the world that people know. So that's harder with pure math or theoretical computer science. But can there be overpopularization? I think what's bad is when they like rush out stuff that they had, for example, with exoplanet research, right? It's always about the new second Earth that they found, although these aren't Earths, and there are a lot of other conditions, and they don't know anything about these planets because you can't look at them. You have very indirect methods of talking about what's happening on them, and there's always an artist's impression of how it might look there. just waiting to see the aliens crawling on the surface. And that might be, and they're rushing these stories out to the public very quickly as soon as they have the results. There might be a danger in overplaying that. But otherwise, popularizing science is a great thing, and I can't get enough of that.
Yeah, so oftentimes, and also it's driven often not by the journalist, but by what's going on either in science and technology. I mean, it's interesting to know, if any of you remember the movie The Graduate, which is now 50 years old this year. It's a half a century old. It was a UC Berkeley graduate. He went to UC, and there was that wonderful scene in which the family member walks up to him and said, "I have one word for you. That word is plastics." And we all know if he'd walked up to him now, it would have been 2 words: machine learning. And it's just stunning, the way machine learning has taken over the conversation. And I mean, I know that's more applied than it is theoretical, but it really dominates the journalistic landscape now. So, I don't think we
in
popularize
some corner of the journal.
Well, in Silicon Valley,
Yeah,
in the Silicon
right.
Valley corner of the. I'm continually surprised by. I had a piece in the Times yesterday on flying cars, and I was, and almost every quote in the article, except from the people from the company, was negative. I was not trying to hype this up. It was something that Larry Page was doing. There were 800 comments. I don't think I've ever written an article at the New York Times that has gotten as many comments. And so I don't know what is it the Jetsons that we all grew up with, or the people of my generation? Why was there so much interest in something like that? I'm mystified. Because people hate traffic. Yeah, maybe that's it. Although there's always second-order effects. I mean, this is the thing that just drives me crazy about the autonomous vehicle argument for sparing us from traffic is just a dream. Already in San Francisco, you can see, but even before we get to autonomous cars, since there are no limits on Uber or Lyft vehicles, we have this huge congestion problem. That's an artifact.
We'll have more, because people won't park their cars anymore.
They'll let it
circle.
Yeah, and everybody will it'll be easier to travel, and everybody will want to go someplace at the same time, which is a recipe for disaster, as far as I can see.
But what we were talking about is, I wouldn't call it over-popularization, but overselling of stuff, of science, and that's a trend. Every science department has a PR department now, and that's the job for critical journalism to separate the wheat from the chaff, or whatever.
Well, so the wheat from the chaff. So I want to turn things around and ask this community something, because one of the things that's happened for me as a technology writer who's covered the field of computer science is, as you flip the model and gone to publish before you peer review, it's made things extremely confusing. And maybe it's making better science, I'm not sure. But from the point of view of a journalist who's trying to understand what's of value in reporting on it, becomes extremely difficult when everything is on archive. And I haven't sorted that out yet. I mean, I would love to hear how, you go back. I fall back on the things I've always fallen back in. I have trusted experts, and I ask them. But my network is it's a biased network by definition, and so I don't really know how to solve that problem to the degree it's a problem.
The answer probably is that the peer-reviewed research wasn't any better, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of, yeah, we always used to quote, it was in the scientific journal named blah blah, and now we know how much bullshit that was in the scientific journal.
Yeah, that's a possible answer. So
this is very interesting, and I think it's clear that this is a huge problem for science journalists. This change in the landscape about what the opportunities are. From the reader's perspective, it's not as clear that it's a problem. I think there's a lot of very high quality content that's available, and maybe it's an issue of curating your own reading list, how you select and even judge what the sources are, and then different people with different backgrounds will have different abilities to discriminate, and so maybe societally this problem that you're experiencing in science journalism, it seems very parallel to the problem with respect to other parts of print journalism, that there is then this kind of disintegration of norms around what actual news is. There's no consensus on, there's no broad consensus, unfortunately, nationally about what actually constitutes real news. And so I'm just wondering if you can put this a little bit in a broader context about what the real consequences are for us as citizens, as readers,
Well, science is different from the rest of the world in the way that it is a method and it has institutions. And as bad as it might, I just said that there's a lot of false, dumb stuff in journals, but still, it's been peer reviewed, right? What do we want peer review? So it has some kind of control mechanism. It might be flawed and must be overhauled. But there is, you can always go back to a source, and then there's authorities. And in news, in general news, it's anybody's guess, right?
Well, there's a lot that's lost. I mean, I admit that there are good bloggers who I use as guides through fields, and they serve an editorial function. But there's another function of an editor that I worry that is lost in the blogosphere, and that is, as we're all atomized, one of the best things about working at the New York Times was I worked collaboratively. And you only saw my byline, but the product was the result of a group of people, and I actually think that improved the quality of the product. So when you atomize everything, everybody's in their pajamas, and that's wonderfully liberating, but it might not make for a better product.
It's some kind of peer review too, right? And
yeah.
Fact checking. I mean, hardly anybody has fact checkers anymore. But if you have a real good fact checker that's sitting and asking you, where did you get that piece of information? Because everybody who writes, even if you don't want to write anything wrong, you love the stuff that you collected and you don't want to throw it out, and then you might not check it thoroughly enough. And then there's these guys but they're not around anymore, right? Most of the time.
Maybe at the New Yorker.
New York Times?
No, at the New Yorker.
The Times doesn't.
The Times has had copy editors. We're cutting back copy editors,
yeah.
I think, sadly. But the Times has never, except in the magazine section, they do fact checking. Yeah, Dan. Oops, and then Erica. Sorry.
I was going to combine the last two questions. So about popularization and the role of journals within the ecosystem. Like the ecosystem includes the public and science. So I think health. So my first question about what's the role of journalism in the deterioration of the public's opinion? So I think nutrition science and health is an area where there's already something of a selection bias in terms of what gets into high-profile journals. And if you add on top of that the journalistic tendency to go for things that are surprising, you get this very biased selection, which is probably more often than not picking things that are false. And then you pump this to the public, who's primed to want to, eat more junk food but still lose weight. And then they get this steady stream of stuff that's bullshit, basically. And then that deteriorates it too. And another example, I think, of something like an uncritical example of how, say, the public has been explained, like, for example, climate change or something like that, where the consequences are so massive. And the whole idea that consensus is relevant, right? If say, 10% of the scientists were concerned, and what's at stake is, say, the collapse of civilization, then that might warrant hedging. But somehow the idea that consensus is important is it's repeated as if that's important. It's not important at all. So I mean, I think science has journalism has an incredibly important role. And when there's like the statistical elements perverting it, and then it's also like ignoring also the role of uncertainty in terms of hedging. So journalism has to be aware of the statistical consequences of how it reports information.
Erica, did you have a question?
Oh, no. I was just going to mention that Quanta uses fact checkers.
Oh, they do. That's great. Maybe.
Yeah, if you have a rich foundation, all the problems are solved, right? You can do
That
anything.
is a model. That Matter, was it Matter or was it Mosaic is supported by the Wellcome Trust, so it's another example of something like quantum. I'm sorry. Yes.
We need more rich people. That's the solution.
About Dan's comment, maybe it's a little unfair to sort of put the burden on journalists on things like, this nutritional kind of science, which are, this population studies, which are all wrong.
Yeah.
If scientists publish something in a journal and, it's basically some sort of non-existent thing, how can, a journalist read that and sort of figure out from the statistic that this is wrong, right? It's unreasonable standard.
Well, I think it matters, right? If it's purely about business, then you want to have lots of articles about losing weight. But I mean, I guess maybe it goes down to like what kind of obligation you have beyond business.
Well, there are publications that have to.
How can you sort of determine that something is wrong? If, you know, it passed peer review,
I mean, how many times is it
presumably
gonna-
experts read it and it was okay.
Well, I have two answers. One is there is a whole genre of journalism, like magazines, women's magazines, who have to churn out a new diet every couple of months, right? So they have to find something revolutionary in it. Of course, that's not. But I wouldn't. That's not science writing. And the thing about, and then we would have to talk about science itself. If you look at magazines like Science and Nature, which are not journalistic products in the first place, but scientific journals, they have a selection bias for things that sound very revolutionary and new. And if you're talking to a statistician, he will say, if you have one experiment, one publication, and it's a very extraordinary result, it's very likely that it's false, right? That it's so. And then, of course, journalists come and pick that out and have the
Amplify
seal
it.
of Science and Nature on it, because we pick those the man bites dog story over the dog bites man story.
Yeah.
To respond to your second point, which I think was super interesting, I think, like, you know, it's not common in our culture at all to think using, like, some understanding of probability and, like, expected value and reasoning in this way, and I don't think it's fair either, even though I think it was a super interesting point, to put the burden on journalists. Like, I think that's probably something for the education system, to, like, teach people, like, oh, you should like, calculate the expected values of things and stuff. But also, like, I wanted to ask a question about ads. Like, you painted this picture where, like, okay, yeah, ad revenues are declining, and also we don't understand, or we think that most, or let's say half of all eyeballs or whatever are bots. So I guess that means that, like, does that mean that advertisers are advertising less because they think that they're spending their money on bots, or?
Well, they've started to. I mean, this is, you know, Facebook was embarrassed publicly about 2 or 3 months ago when they had to admit that they were counting their videos all wrong and the advertisers were being ripped off. And there have been a set of things that have suggested that the advertisers should change their behavior, or actually should wake up. And there is some evidence, I think, that they've started to. But by and large, you know, the advertisers have been in this new system, the sucker who's being played. And we're starting to see the advertisers change behavior. But up until now, they have been funding this new ecosystem that's been exploited by fake news. So they've been they have been the heart of the problem, actually.
And Google is winning, right?
Yeah.
They get a piece of all the cakes. Yeah.
So with increasing diversification and specialization in science, right, more and more fields are coming up, more and more research is happening everywhere. Don't you think that it's inevitable that you have more diversity of talent and skill on people who are introducing those concepts to the humanity?
Now, are you talking about the scientists or the journalists?
The line between the scientists and the journalists.
As
Probably extent, right? And then you'll have a crowdsourced situation in which random people come up and talk about things that they see. And also, as more and more people come online, you have a larger and a more stable market, so more and more players will come in and probably politicize, and because of other.
Yeah.
And so there's also a feedback loop, right, which probably changes the government's opinions on which science projects to fund and which ones to. So, do you think there's a way?
I was in your camp until I discovered that there was a very relatively small group of people in this new world who were being paid to work as journalists. So I would have, if that was right, if there's going to be this, sort of lively new ecosystem, you think it would be bubbling up opportunities for a new class of journalists. And I'm hoping that you're right, and that's what will emerge. It's just, I was very disheartened to see where we are right now, and maybe it's early, but it seems like this technology is reinventing itself regularly. I mean, we've gone from desktop to this handheld thing just in the last 5 years. Now everybody's reading their news in this format. I don't think this is the end of the road. I am willing to bet you that there's some new format and everything is transformed once more in the next 5 years, whether it's augmented reality or what. This is not the end of the line. And in a sense, the medium is the message. Every new medium creates a new structure. And I think it's going to just continue to happen.
Yeah, we kind of mislabeled this whole thing because we were talking about the future, and we have a hard time talking about the present, right? Yeah. We don't quite understand the present yet, and it's developing.
So I don't know if this is exactly a question or whatever, but it occurs to me, I have 2 teenage sons who are 13, and all they do online, not all, but a lot of what they do online is watch YouTube videos. And these guys, and they actually know a lot about it. These guys have millions of viewers, and they're making a lot of money off of this. Yeah. So first question, is that's not included in what you're talking about in terms of...
Well, I mean, is it journalism or is it entertainment, or can you can you divide? I see a little bit of both.
They're taking, maybe, it's all about getting eyeballs. That's where you get money.
Yeah, that's right.
These guys, they didn't used to exist.
No, and in fact, that could be the point from which this new ecosystem is emerging. Maybe it's already there. I don't go to YouTube now for my science journalism by and large, although I'm starting to see things. But I know that the people you're talking about who are making millions of dollars, they're usually comics. I mean, at least in YouTube now. And I mean, they're great fun to watch, but Dan Rather hasn't moved over there successfully. I mean, I don't see... I mean, maybe you're right. I just don't see it yet.
And if you're talking about people who make money on YouTube, it's a very thin layer of cream on top of the...
Yeah. Yes, that's true, but I look at your numbers and it seems like maybe there's more of those YouTubers than are included in your numbers.
It's possible. It's possible. But I mean, are any of you habituated? I mean, your 13-year-old kids are any of you habituated to getting your news from YouTube?
Yeah, but that's where they start, right?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. Okay, so, we wait a decade. Yeah.
I'm curious about the difference between scientific journalism and science and technology journalism.
Well, I mean, so I was part of this phenomenon that really began in terms of covering consumer technologies. I mean, that was sort of what paid the freight. And so my career started largely because all of a sudden there was this industry called the personal computer industry, and it had publications, and there was this huge sucking sound as they needed journalists. And just because of my own interest, I've always felt that there should be a role for technology reporting that doesn't sit in the business section. It's always been a trouble. They can never figure out where to put technology writers. When I first came to the New York Times, it was in my mind it was a wonderful period because there was a weekly box for reporting that I called explanatory technology writing, which was not science writing, but it was similar, and sometimes it did shade directly into science writing, and that went away, and for a while the Times had a consumer technology section, like many papers that came and went very quickly. We went with the dot-com bubble; it all vanished. They're engineering sciences. I felt my role was to report on the advances in those fields and their impact on society, which is a little bit different than being in the business section of although that's where it would sit.
Want to wrap it up?
It's been a terrific dialogue, and I'm sure we could go on for a long time. But I think it might be good to take just 1 or 2 more questions, and then we will conclude and thank the speakers. So,
yes. So I had a question about, you were saying tech and business sections, I think you were trying to say that they should be more separate, or?
Well, I often, in an ideal world, I think that there would be a sort of a place for writing about the impact of technology on society, and there are publications that focus on that.
Great story by John Carreyrou about the Theranos mess, right? I mean, that was a fantastic example of,
And that you could argue that should be in the business section. I mean, that was.
Well, I don't know whether it was in the business section or the tech section.
Well, it was in the Wall Street Journal.
It's similar with media topics, like the New York Times has, when you have a story about Fox News and their allegations, it's in the business section. Although it doesn't talk about dollars at all, but just about sexual harassment.
Yeah.
So
and so
it's in the business section.
Yeah. I mean, the notion of sections in newspapers is rather new, just historically, in its own right.
few have been operating in countries that have a relatively free press. If you were describing the state of science and technology journalism in countries that are less democratic and less free, would you see a very different situation?
Well, my experience, the only place I have experience is in China, where I've spent some time. And they, in terms of writing about technology and science, they have very lively, I mean, I can't read their language, but just in talking to their journalists, it's pretty clear that there is a lively journalistic community there, even though they don't. I mean, you know, in going to China now, I just felt so much like, my God, I've arrived in Silicon Valley. It feels exactly like Silicon Valley in some ways. And then all of a sudden, if you spend some time with people, you realize, oh yeah, in every way except they don't have this thing called democracy. You know, culturally it's very similar, except without this sort of little quirk about democracy. So,
and I can tell you that, for example, in Eastern Europe, in times of communism, they had a lot of reporting on technology. Of course, not in any critical way about their nuclear power plants or things like that. But that was some part that they you know, held up. And now in other countries, I don't know. The World Meeting of Science Journalists will be in San Francisco this year.
October.
So in October,
yeah,
you can maybe peek in, or maybe you'll hear about.
Well, this has been great. We'll have to do more of this in the future, and we'd like to thank you very much.